September 6, 1940. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Carenhall, his opulent hunting estate north of Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring received the intelligence briefing with barely concealed satisfaction. The report, delivered by Oberst Joseph Beppo Schmid, chief of the Luftwaffe's 5th Abteilung, the intelligence directorate, confirmed what the German High Command desperately wanted to believe. After weeks of relentless aerial assault against Britain, fighter command of the Royal Air Force had been reduced to a hollow shell. Schmid's estimate was definitive. The British could muster no more than 100 serviceable fighters. Some reports suggested perhaps 150 at the absolute maximum. The conclusion seemed inescapable. The RAF was finished. The door to invasion stood open, and final victory was merely a matter of days away. What neither Goring nor Schmid knew, what their entire intelligence apparatus had catastrophically failed to discover, was that at that precise moment, across the English Channel, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's fighter command could actually field 738 operational aircraft, with an additional 256 fighters in storage depots ready for immediate dispatch. The German miscalculation wasn't merely wrong by a factor of 2 or 3. It was wrong by a factor of 7. The Luftwaffe was about to hurl itself against an enemy it believed was on its knees, only to discover that the RAF remained standing, defiant, and more than capable of delivering a devastating counterpunch. The intelligence failure that led to this moment would prove to be one of the most consequential errors of the Second World War, an error rooted not in a lack of resources or technology, but in something far more insidious, an organizational culture that valued loyalty over truth, confirmation over investigation, and ambition over accuracy. The story of how the Luftwaffe came to so catastrophically misunderstand its adversary begins not in the summer of 1940, but years earlier, in the Byzantine political structure of the Third Reich itself. Intelligence gathering in Nazi Germany was a fractured, competitive enterprise, with more than a dozen separate agencies operating independently, jealously guarding their sources and conclusions. The Abwehr handled military intelligence, the Gestapo pursued internal threats, the Foreign Ministry maintained its own information networks, and the SS cultivated separate channels of information. Within the Luftwaffe itself, at least 2 major intelligence organizations operated with minimal coordination. The 5th Abteilung, responsible for general intelligence assessment, and the 3rd Abteilung, which handled signals intelligence. The rivalry between these 2 departments was so intense that they rarely shared information, leading directly to erroneous assessments. Information flowed vertically within each agency, but almost never horizontally between them. Only at the very apex, in the person of Adolf Hitler himself, did the potential exist for a comprehensive picture to emerge. But Hitler, like Goring, preferred intelligence that confirmed his preconceptions rather than challenged them. The institutional culture of Luftwaffe intelligence virtually guaranteed failure. Intelligence officers were perceived as maids of all work, staffed with low-quality personnel whose contributions were considered of limited value to operational planning. The intelligence directorate was subordinated to the operations staff, meaning that operational officers, men focused on planning attacks rather than understanding the enemy, often prepared their own intelligence assessments without input from the specialists. More damaging still was the Nazi regime's treatment of unwelcome information. In the Third Reich, bearing bad news could be a career-ending or life-ending mistake. Hitler, Goring, and General Hans Jeschneck, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, all demonstrated a marked dislike for intelligence reports that contradicted their personal visions. Intelligence analysts learned quickly that survival and advancement depended not on accuracy, but on telling superiors what they wished to hear. Colonel Schmid became renowned within the Luftwaffe for garnishing his reports to make them more palatable to Goring. The result was an intelligence apparatus that functioned less as a tool for understanding reality and more as a mechanism for reinforcing institutional delusions. Into this dysfunctional system stepped Joseph Beppo Schmid, a man whose ambition exceeded his competence and whose loyalty to Goring outweighed his commitment to truth. Schmid had served as Goring's personal friend, and he understood that his position depended on maintaining that friendship rather than providing accurate intelligence. He was shrewd and calculating, removing staff members who might challenge him and replacing them with subordinates who would not question his conclusions. When Goring tasked him with assessing British capabilities in preparation for potential conflict, Schmid approached the assignment with the understanding that his primary objective was not to discover the truth about Britain, but to confirm what Goring already believed, that the Luftwaffe was invincible and that Britain was vulnerable. In early 1940, Schmid's team produced what would become the foundation document for all subsequent German planning against Britain, Studie Blau, or Study Blue. The methodology behind this critical intelligence assessment revealed the amateurish nature of Luftwaffe intelligence gathering. The major sources for Study Blue were officially published maps and handbooks, British newspaper articles, and, remarkably, a book about British industry that had been ordered directly from a London bookshop. There were no deep-cover agents providing insights into RAF capabilities, no sophisticated analysis of British industrial production, and no serious effort to understand the revolutionary air defense system that Britain had been constructing for years. The study was, in the assessment of later historians, a mixture of truth and falsehood that portrayed too favorably the chances of German success. Study Blue made several critical errors, but none more consequential than its complete failure to understand the significance of radar and the integrated air defense network that the British called the Dowding System. This was particularly inexplicable because Germany had pioneered radar technology, and the Luftwaffe's third Abteilung, the Signals Intelligence Directorate under General Wolfgang Martini, had actually detected British radar transmissions before the war began. In July and August 1939, the airship Graf Zeppelin had flown missions along the British coast specifically to intercept RAF radio and radar transmissions. The Germans had collected concrete evidence that Britain possessed a functioning radar network. Yet this information either never reached Colonel Schmid, or he chose to dismiss its significance. Study Blue mentioned radar only in passing and concluded that even if the system existed, it would be rigid and inflexible, easily overwhelmed by massed formations of German aircraft. The truth was precisely the opposite. The Dowding System, named for Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, represented the world's first wide-area ground-controlled interception network. It integrated radar stations along the coast known as Chain Home with the Royal Observer Corps, a network of 30,000 trained civilian volunteers manning more than 1,000 observation posts throughout Britain. Information from these sources flowed through dedicated telephone lines to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, where operators in the filter room plotted the location, altitude, heading, and estimated strength of every formation in British airspace. This centralized picture was then relayed to group and sector headquarters, where controllers directed fighter squadrons to intercept specific raids with devastating precision. The system acted as a force multiplier of extraordinary effectiveness. In pre-war exercises, interception rates of 30 to 50% were considered excellent, meaning that more than half of fighter patrols returned without encountering the enemy. During the Battle of Britain, RAF interception rates averaged around 90%, and several raids were met with 100% success rates. The Dowding system conferred another crucial advantage that German intelligence failed to appreciate. It allowed Fighter Command to husband its limited resources with extraordinary efficiency. Rather than mounting exhausting standing patrols that burned fuel and wore out pilots, RAF fighters could remain on the ground until the last possible moment, then scramble to meet incoming raids with full fuel tanks and alert crews. This meant that a smaller force could generate far more effective combat sorties than a larger force operating without ground control. The Germans, lacking any comparable system, attributed RAF success in locating their formations to luck. As one analysis noted, in the first 5 weeks of the Battle of Britain, the lucky RAF outshot the Luftwaffe day after day, losing 128 planes but destroying 255 by August 12. Schmid's July 16, 1940 intelligence assessment, delivered on the same day that Hitler issued Directive No. 16 ordering preparations for the invasion of Britain, compounded the errors of Study Blue. This report, which became the operational foundation for the Luftwaffe's campaign, estimated that Fighter Command possessed approximately 900 first-line fighters, of which about 675 were serviceable. This estimate, while far more accurate than the 100-fighter assessment that would emerge later, still fundamentally misunderstood RAF strength because it failed to account for Britain's rapidly expanding aircraft production and the sophisticated dispersal system that made RAF fighters extraordinarily difficult to destroy on the ground. Schmid's report made sweeping claims about aircraft performance that reflected more wishful thinking than rigorous analysis. He asserted that both the Hurricane and Spitfire were inferior to the Messerschmitt Bf 109, with the Hurricane particularly outclassed. While the Bf 109 did possess certain performance advantages, Particularly in dive speed and high-altitude performance, this blanket assertion ignored the Spitfire's superior turning radius and the Hurricane's effectiveness as a bomber-destroyer. More significantly, the report completely failed to grasp that in aerial combat, tactics, training, and situational awareness often matter more than raw performance specifications. RAF pilots fighting over their own territory enjoyed enormous advantages. They could bail out over friendly ground and return to combat the same day. They could fight at the edge of their fuel limits while German pilots had to reserve fuel for the long flight home. And they received constant guidance from ground controllers who could vector them into advantageous positions. The Luftwaffe's blind spot regarding RAF airfield dispersal would prove particularly costly. Fighter command operated through a hierarchical structure of sector stations and satellite airfields. Each sector station, major airfields like Biggin Hill, Tangmere, and Nordholt, served as the operational nerve center, equipped with operations rooms and direct links to group headquarters. But squadrons could be dispersed to satellite aerodromes, smaller fields that were often little more than grass strips with minimal facilities. These satellite fields were fully equipped enough to operate fighters, but were so austere and dispersed that they presented extremely difficult targets. The Germans, working from peacetime maps and aerial reconnaissance, consistently misidentified which airfields were actually operational fighter bases. Fighter bases were tagged as bomber bases, and critical sector stations were sometimes not identified at all. Throughout August 1940, the Luftwaffe launched determined attacks against what intelligence indicated were vital RAF airfields, only to discover they had bomb training facilities, bomber bases, or installations of no operational significance to fighter command. On August 17, 1940, after a particularly heavy series of raids, Luftwaffe intelligence claimed that 11 RAF airfields had been permanently destroyed with another 12 severely damaged. Every single one of these airfields remained operational. The British had developed a remarkable capacity for rapid repair, with crews working through the night to fill bomb craters and restore facilities. But the Germans, relying on aerial reconnaissance photographs showing cratered runways and damaged buildings, convinced themselves that they were systematically dismantling fighter command's infrastructure. The disconnect between German perception and British reality grew wider with each passing day. An even more fundamental intelligence failure concerned British aircraft production. Schmid's assessments consistently underestimated Britain's industrial capability, concluding that British factories could not possibly match German output. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. In 1940, Britain produced 15,049 aircraft compared to just 10,247 in Germany. During the critical months of the Battle of Britain was producing approximately twice as many single-engine fighters as Germany. Much of this production surge was due to the efforts of Lord Beaverbrook, whom Churchill had appointed Minister of Aircraft Production in May 1940. Beaverbrook brought entrepreneurial ruthlessness to the task, cutting through bureaucracy, raiding other programs for resources, and driving factory managers to unprecedented output. The result was that even as fighter command suffered losses in combat, the supply of replacement aircraft never faltered. The Germans, meanwhile, convinced themselves that they were destroying RAF fighters faster than they could be replaced, when in reality the opposite was true. The Luftwaffe also fundamentally misunderstood the pace of RAF pilot losses and replacement. Throughout August and into September, German intelligence estimates of RAF casualties ran 3 to 4 times higher than actual losses. Luftwaffe pilots, fighting far from home in the chaos of aerial combat, genuinely believed their victory claims. When multiple pilots claimed to have shot down the same aircraft, or when damaged aircraft that limped home were counted as destroyed, the cumulative effect was a grotesquely inflated assessment of German success. German intelligence, rather than applying rigorous analysis to correct for these known biases, simply accepted pilot claims at face value and reinforced the narrative that fighter command was bleeding to death. The truth was more nuanced and more alarming for the Germans. Fighter command was indeed under severe strain by late August 1940. Hugh Dowding, watching the casualty lists mount, instituted a 3-tier system for squadron classification. Category A squadrons, at full strength in pilots and aircraft, bore the brunt of combat in the critical southeastern sector under Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's 11 Group. Category B squadrons served as reserves, to be committed only if necessary. Category C squadrons, reduced to as few as 5 or 6 pilots, were devoted to training replacements in quieter sectors. The system was potentially dangerous. If the battle continued at its current intensity, Category C squadrons would become progressively less effective as a training pipeline. But as of mid-September, the system was working. Replacement pilots, though often minimally trained, were arriving in sufficient numbers. Fighter command was not on the verge of collapse. It was adapting, surviving, and preparing to counterattack. On the evening of September 14, 1940, the eve of what would become known as Battle of Britain Day, Fighter Command could muster 269 Supermarine Spitfires and 533 Hawker Hurricanes. The two groups bearing the heaviest combat, 11 Group under Keith Park and 12 Group under Trafford Leigh-Mallory, could field just over 500 fighters between them. If 10 Group in the southwest joined the battle, another 126 fighters could be committed. This was only 22 fewer Spitfires and Hurricanes than had been available on August 17, at the height of the German offensive. Fighter command was tired, stretched, and operating under enormous pressure. But it was not defeated, not even close to defeat. The Germans, however, believed precisely the opposite. The divergence between German perception and British reality reached its apex in early September 1940. Goring, receiving constant reports of massive RAF losses and destroyed airfields, concluded that fighter command had been effectively eliminated as a fighting force. Schmid's intelligence summaries supported this conclusion, estimating that the British had been reduced to 100 serviceable fighters. Some assessments ranged as high as 150, but the consensus within the Luftwaffe High Command was clear. One more massive blow would finish fighter command entirely. The decision was made to shift the focus of operations from attacking RAF airfields to launching a massive daylight assault on London itself. This would serve multiple purposes. It would terrorize the civilian population, destroy port facilities and industrial targets, and, most importantly, force the last remnants of fighter command into a final, decisive battle where German numerical superiority would prove overwhelming. The German commanders were so confident that they publicly announced their certainty of victory. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of Luftwaffe II, claimed that fighter command had been destroyed. Field Marshal Hugo Spurl, commander of Luftwaffe III, was slightly more cautious, estimating that the RAF retained perhaps 1,000 aircraft, but agreed that British resistance was crumbling. Goring himself assured Hitler that Britain's air defenses were broken and that the invasion, Operation Sea Lion, could proceed. The Luftwaffe was suffering from what one historian later characterized as a massive overdose of confidence bred from its impressive performance up until that time. Poland, Norway, France, the Low Countries, all had fallen before German air power with stunning rapidity. Britain, in German eyes, was simply another enemy to be overwhelmed. The only question was how long it would take. September 15, 1940, dawned clear and bright over southern England, perfect flying weather. German air crews assembled at bases across occupied France and the Low Countries, preparing for what they had been told would be the final, decisive blow. Around midday, the first massive formation, over 200 bombers escorted by fighters, began crossing the English Channel, heading directly for London. RAF radar operators detected the formation while it was still assembling over France. In the filter room at Bentley Priory, WAFs moved colored markers across the plotting table as the raid developed. At 11 Group headquarters, Keith Park watched the situation develop and made his decision. Every available squadron in 11 Group would engage. He requested support from 12 Group and 10 Group. This was the moment fighter command had been preserving its strength for, the opportunity to meet a major German raid with overwhelming force. As the German bombers droned toward London, confident that they would face only token opposition from the shattered remnants of fighter command, they encountered instead a sky filled with RAF fighters. Spitfires and Hurricanes attacked in wave after wave, hitting the bomber formations from multiple angles. The Germans, expecting to fight through a handful of desperate defenders, found themselves in a massive aerial battle against an enemy that appeared in undiminished strength. The escort fighters, operating at the extreme edge of their fuel range, could not maintain protection over the bombers. RAF controllers, watching the plot develop in real time, vectored fresh squadrons into the battle as German formations attempted to withdraw. The aerial combat raged for hours. A second major raid in the afternoon met the same ferocious resistance. By evening, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 50 aircraft. The exact number remains disputed, but more importantly, the German commanders were forced to confront a devastating truth. Fighter command had not been destroyed. The RAF possessed not 100 fighters but hundreds, perhaps close to the original estimates of 600 or more. The British were not on their knees, not broken, not on the verge of collapse. Every intelligence assessment, every optimistic report, every reassuring estimate had been catastrophically wrong. The reaction within the German High Command was one of shocked disbelief. How could they have been so mistaken? Where had all these British fighters come from? Winston Churchill, who had spent the day visiting 11 Group headquarters and watching the battle develop on the plotting table, addressed the nation that evening by radio. His words carefully reinforced the German misconception even while celebrating RAF success. Aided by Czech and Polish squadrons and using only a small proportion of their total strength, the Royal Air Force cut to rags and tatters separate waves of murderous assault upon the civil population of their native land. The phrase, only a small proportion of their total strength, was calculated to suggest to German intelligence analysts that the RAF possessed even deeper reserves than it actually did. In reality, fighter command had committed a very substantial proportion of its available strength to the battle. But Churchill understood that the psychological impact of the victory would be magnified if the Germans believed they had been defeated by merely a fraction of British air power. The intelligence failure that culminated on September 15, 1940, had profound strategic consequences. 2 days later, on September 17, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion until further notice. The postponement became permanent, without air superiority, and the events of September 15 had demonstrated conclusively that air superiority could not be achieved. An amphibious invasion of Britain was suicidal. The Luftwaffe continued to bomb Britain throughout the autumn and winter of 1940-41, shifting to nighttime raids to avoid the devastating losses suffered in daylight. But the strategic initiative had shifted. Britain had not merely survived. It had won time to rebuild, rearm, and prepare for the long war ahead. The German failure to understand RAF capabilities stemmed from multiple causes, but at its root was a dysfunctional intelligence culture that valued political acceptability over factual accuracy. Colonel Schmid had built his career on telling Goring what Goring wanted to hear. When General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf produced sobering assessments of Luftwaffe weaknesses in potential operations against Britain, he was relieved of command. The message was clear. Officers who questioned the prevailing optimism would be removed. Those who reinforced it would be rewarded. The result was an intelligence apparatus that functioned as an echo chamber, amplifying the prejudices of senior leadership rather than challenging them with uncomfortable facts. The organizational structure of German intelligence compounded these cultural failures. The lack of coordination between the 5th Abteilung and the 3rd Abteilung meant that valuable signals intelligence often never reached the analysts preparing operational assessments. The broader fragmentation of intelligence gathering across more than a dozen agencies in the Reich meant that no single organization possessed a comprehensive picture of British capabilities. Each agency jealously guarded its sources and conclusions, viewing other agencies as rivals rather than collaborators. Information flowed upward to Hitler but rarely moved horizontally between organizations where it might be synthesized into actionable intelligence. The failure to appreciate the Dowding System represented perhaps the single most consequential intelligence blind spot. Even after the battle had been raging for weeks, German intelligence continued to characterize the British air defense network as rigid and inflexible, tied to fixed bases and unable to respond effectively to massed attacks. The reality was that the Dowding System was extraordinarily flexible and responsive, capable of directing fighters with precision against specific threats. German pilots, accustomed to operating with minimal ground control, could not comprehend the advantage that integrated air defense conferred on their opponents. They flew mission after mission into British airspace, often without encountering RAF fighters, and when they did encounter them, the RAF was almost always in an advantageous position. Yet German intelligence never successfully reverse-engineered the British system or understood why the RAF was so effective at interception. The British, for their part, worked diligently to maintain German ignorance about the true nature of their defenses. When radar stations were damaged by bombing, they continued to transmit signals even when unable to receive, deceiving German signals intelligence into believing that attacks on radar installations were ineffective. Pilot reports suggesting that the critical components of radar stations were located in bomb-proof bunkers reinforced this deception. Based on these conclusions, the Luftwaffe discontinued attacks on radar sites altogether, leaving intact the very system that was coordinating Fighter Command's defense. The British also maintained strict radio discipline and operational security, ensuring that German intercepts of RAF communications provided minimal useful intelligence. The dispersal of RAF fighters across sector stations and satellite airfields proved far more effective than German intelligence ever appreciated. When Luftwaffe bombers attacked what they believed to be critical fighter bases, they often found their bombs falling on secondary facilities or empty fields. The sector stations that actually controlled fighter operations were sometimes not identified at all, or were mistakenly classified as bomber bases. Even when genuine fighter bases were hit, the damage was rarely permanent. British repair crews demonstrated remarkable skill at restoring cratered runways and damaged facilities within hours. Aircraft dispersed to satellite fields could continue operations even when the main sector station was under attack. The entire system was designed for resilience and redundancy, qualities that German intelligence failed to recognize or understand. British aircraft production, too, remained a mystery to German intelligence throughout the battle. Schmid's assessments consistently projected that Britain would run out of fighters, that production could not keep pace with losses, that the industrial base was inadequate to sustain a prolonged campaign. These projections were based on peacetime production rates and failed to account for the transformative effect of Lord Beaverbrook's ruthless drive to maximize fighter output. British factories were producing Spitfires and Hurricanes at a rate that German intelligence deemed impossible, and this production continued to accelerate even as the battle raged. The result was that Fighter Command, despite suffering real losses in August and September, never faced a crisis in aircraft availability. Pilot losses were more serious, but even here, the training pipeline continued to function, delivering replacement pilots who, while often inadequately trained, were sufficient to maintain squadron strength. The psychological dimension of the intelligence failure was perhaps most significant. The Luftwaffe had been conditioned by previous victories to expect rapid success. Poland had fallen in weeks, France in 6 weeks. The assumption pervading German military planning was that Britain, isolated and alone, would collapse with similar speed once subjected to determined assault. When Fighter Command proved unexpectedly resilient, German commanders interpreted this not as evidence that their intelligence was flawed, but as an indication that the RAF was expending its last reserves in a desperate final stand. Each day that Fighter Command continued to resist, German intelligence assured the High Command, brought the inevitable British collapse one day closer. The possibility that British strength had been fundamentally underestimated, that the RAF was not on the verge of defeat but capable of sustaining indefinite resistance, was psychologically unacceptable. It contradicted too many assumptions, challenged too many preconceptions, and implied that the Luftwaffe might actually lose. So the intelligence assessments continued to project imminent British collapse, and the German High Command continued to believe them, right up until September 15th when reality could no longer be denied. The long-term consequences of this intelligence failure extended far beyond the Battle of Britain itself. The inability to achieve air superiority over Britain forced Hitler to postpone and ultimately cancel Operation Sea Lion, ensuring that Britain remained in the war as a base for future Allied operations. The survival of Britain meant that the United States, when it entered the war, would have a secure platform from which to launch operations against occupied Europe. The failed invasion attempt convinced Hitler to turn his attention eastward, leading to the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. A decision that would prove catastrophic for Germany. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that the Luftwaffe was not invincible, that German military planning could be seriously flawed, and that intelligence failures could have strategic consequences. These lessons would be repeated throughout the war as German intelligence continued to underestimate enemy capabilities and overestimate German strength. For the RAF, the victory in the Battle of Britain validated the years of investment in the Dowding System and proved the value of integrated air defense. The combination of radar, ground observers, centralized control, and effective fighters created a defensive system that could defeat a numerically superior attacker. Churchill's famous tribute, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," honored the courage of RAF pilots, but the victory was equally a triumph of technology, organization, and intelligence. The British had built a system, kept its nature secret, and exploited German ignorance with devastating effectiveness. The intelligence war proved as important as the aerial combat itself. Hugh Dowding, the architect of Britain's air defense system, received less recognition than he deserved. He was removed from command of Fighter Command in November 1940, a victim of bureaucratic politics and personal rivalries that had little to do with his performance during the battle. But his legacy endured in the system he had built and in the victory it had achieved. Keith Park, who commanded 11 Group throughout the most critical phases of the battle, later received this tribute from Air Chief Marshal Lord Tedder. "If ever any one man won the Battle of Britain, he did. I don't believe it is realized how much that one man, with his leadership, his calm judgment and his skill, did to save not only this country, but the world." The same could be said of Dowding, whose vision and persistence had created the defensive system that made victory possible. The German intelligence failure in the Battle of Britain stands as a case study in how institutional culture, political constraints, and human psychology can combine to produce catastrophic misjudgments. The Luftwaffe possessed the technical means to gather accurate intelligence about British capabilities. German radar technology was advanced, signals intelligence was collecting useful information, and aerial reconnaissance provided detailed photographs of British facilities. The failure was not in collection but in analysis and dissemination. Information that contradicted prevailing assumptions was dismissed or ignored. Intelligence analysts tailored their reports to match what senior commanders wanted to hear. Rivalries between agencies prevented the synthesis of collected information into coherent assessments. The result was an intelligence apparatus that, despite access to substantial data, consistently produced conclusions that bore little relationship to reality. The lesson resonates across military history. Intelligence is only valuable if it is accurate, and accuracy requires an organizational culture that values truth over comfort, analysis over ideology, and evidence over assumption. The Luftwaffe in 1940 valued none of these things. Its intelligence service was structured to confirm preconceptions, not challenge them. The results were predictable and disastrous. On September 15, 1940, when German bomber crews crossed the English Channel expecting to encounter token resistance from a defeated enemy, they instead met a sky full of fighters from an air force that had never been broken. The shock of that encounter rippled through the German high command, forcing a reassessment that came too late to change the outcome. Britain had survived, the invasion had been averted, and the course of the war had been altered by an intelligence failure of staggering proportions. A failure built on the foundation of telling leaders what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know.